You're watching WCSD Cable Television from Calloway County High School.
The standards of each new growing generation are inevitably influenced by what teaches them, whether it be an elementary school teacher or a college professor. Retired Professor Mick Miller worked in the field of communication sciences for 48 years and taught at Murray State University for 20, and is here today as our guest. I'm your host, Noah Rudolph, and this is Calloway Connections. So, Dr. Miller, where are you from?
I'm originally from northern Indiana, South Bend.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Indiana University and then to the University of Washington and then eventually Purdue University.
Indiana or Purdue are both in Indiana, right?
They are.
So how close are they to your home?
Oh, about 100 miles.
That's a little bit of a ways, but at least it's not like across the country or anything. So what did you first study?
Well, I first studied fun and games. But I eventually became very interested in the communication sciences and eventually finished a PhD in speech and hearing sciences at Purdue.
Did this change between any of the certain colleges? Like, did you go to one originally for something else?
Well, at Indiana University, of course, I was doing my general studies, and you know, I didn't really have a chance to get too much of a feeling for anything else. But late in my years there, I worked for an individual who was a psycholinguist. And I'd never heard of a psycholinguist before, but I had a lot of fun working for him. I was kind of good with my hands, and he needed somebody to keep his shop in order and build bits and pieces for doing his research. He worked with young infants and did a lot of work with the infants and their mothers, studying how very young children learn to communicate with individuals, because after all they start out knowing very little, and become pretty much experts in speech and language by the time they're, two and a half?
Yeah, so babies are incredibly adaptable during those early years. So you were directly influenced by this psycholinguist.
Yes.
So what did you do exactly while you were with them, other than?
Well, a goodly amount of his work had to do with discovering whether very young kids could discern differences between different speech sounds. Obviously, they learned this at some point in time, but the question was when. So, for example, he might play a tape loop that had ba, 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 ba on it, and the child would be nursing at the time, usually on a bottle that his mother brought with her. And then suddenly, within all of that, instead of a ba, he'd introduce pa. And the question was, well, did the child notice? And usually, the way the child would notice would be to stop nursing and look around, or become more alert at least, you know. So I helped him put together apparatus that would make that happen, and tools in the early days of our field where technology like we're working with right now just didn't exist.
So what year was this?
This was 1970.
Yeah, that was a while ago. We didn't have a lot of the technology we had today. So where is this in the timeline? Was this between, what college was this exactly?
Indiana University.
Okay. So when did you decide to switch over to the other university?
Well, let me think. How did that all work? Well, I finished my bachelor's degree. That was about 1971 that I finished. And I went to the University of Washington for graduate studies. So that's how the timing on that worked.
So did you decide to come back to Purdue to finish a doctorate?
Yes.
Okay.
I got to know a pretty well-known researcher who was currently at Purdue. And I met him at a convention, as a matter of fact. I don't remember which one. There were many of them. But he kind of took me under his wing and said, well, come and study with me and we can do good things together. So I did.
So was he a teacher or?
He was a full professor at Purdue. His name was Raymond Daniloff, and he was pretty much my mentor from that point in time forward.
Okay. So when did you get your first job, and where was it?
My first job was in a laboratory that doesn't exist anymore, but it was very well known in its time. In 1978, if I remember correctly, and I was hired to do exclusively research in the speech and hearing sciences in that lab. It was the Kresge Hearing Research Laboratory of the South. There was also one of the East and the West, and I don't know. But in that lab, I had the opportunity to do 100% research, no required teaching. And that was great fun. We had major university or institutional grants, federal grants mostly, that paid my salary and those of most of the other colleagues working there. And, well, we covered the gamut. There were individuals who were strictly audiologists, hearing disorder researchers, if you will. There were several people who were very much outside our normal hearing orientation, but their work coincided in one form or another with ours, and so together as a group, we had what was called a program project.
So is there like a big difference between communication sciences and audio, that type of stuff?
The difference actually is quite small. Okay. The biggest difference, for example, the head of our laboratory was an audiologist, certified for diagnosing and to a certain degree treating hearing disorders. Now, mind you, most of the treatment of hearing disorders was and even now today still is a medical issue, but the audiologist holds a special role in being able to evaluate just exactly what is going right or wrong with any individual's hearing, and being able to specify that so that specialized tools can be developed and adjusted to suit the needs of that individual.
Okay, so what happened to the laboratory?
Basically, the federal granting system, the National Institutes of Health, which still exists, of course, developed many, many priorities, and over the years of the laboratory's existence, some of the researchers moved into other fields and took elements of their work with them. And the lab, at this point in time, although I'm not certain it still exists, it could still in name, but is not as dynamic as it was when I was there.
Okay. So what university did you work at before MSU?
I worked primarily at two universities over the years. One was Louisiana State University. After the research laboratory, which was in New Orleans, I moved up to Baton Rouge with the colleagues and Dr. Daniloff to develop their communication disorders training program. And then eventually I came to Murray State in 1992, if I remember correctly,
Okay.
and finished my years of employment in the field here and retired in 2013.
So, about the, what was it, the communication disorder, like teaching program at Baton Rouge, go into that.
Well, again, there are many different components to what communication's all about. And mostly it can be broken up into hearing, speech, and language. And of course, those are three pretty big specialty areas, each of which kind of feeds together to deal with the needs of human beings who have various disorders of communication. Even today, an awful lot that we'd like to know about speech and hearing and language, which of course sits above all of that and helps us think in many ways, all those come together in very complicated ways, but the specialists in each sub-area kind of meld to get that going. So no one individual knows everything that they need to know to get it all done.
So, in that sense, were you like a generalist in the communication sciences?
Actually, no. I was, my doctoral degree was in speech science. And my focus was in how it is that the sounds that we think of as speech, which differ from language to language, of course, all over the world, somehow all go together to help us eventually think about and deal with the world we live in. And of course, it's easy to say, well, French is a language and Spanish is a language, but in our profession, we think of the thing, language, as what sets human beings apart from animals. It's not like a dog doesn't understand elements of speech. Say hamburger on my beagle and see what happens. So, we learned a long time ago to spell that. The dog can't spell yet. But with practice, I'm sure she'll get H-A-M, But the thing is that somehow thinking, for human beings at least, is tied very closely to language. So much so that if you have had a second language, do you study languages here?
I studied Spanish as a requirement, but not, I didn't pursue it.
Did you ever discover yourself dreaming or thinking in Spanish
I've
instead
heard a
of
lot
English?
Of that. That sounds very interesting, but I didn't go far enough into understanding Spanish in order to hit that point.
Well, it does happen to people who get to the point where they can hold a conversation in either language. And when that happens, something's going on that stands above language, the language that you speak in, because they can think either way. But sometimes the way they put together their thoughts does seem to be influenced by the language they're speaking. I mean, it's easy to say that, for example, French is a Romance language, This perhaps might not be quite as true as we'd like it to be, but it is certainly a different language than Russian. And both are quite different from Chinese.
So many different fields of emotion to go into with each language, different words that mean different, more esoteric things, sort of.
Yes. And of course, one of the things that's fascinated me since my retirement is simply looking at the number of different words that are shared across languages. And sometimes it's just as simple as, well, we come up with a word to describe something and we're trying to talk to people from other countries. They pick up our word because, well, hey, it means that, But sometimes I think there's a foundation that underlies how we utilize language as human beings that reflects why some words work better than others, or some sounds even work better than others. I don't know a lot about any of that, but I've been daydreaming about it ever since I retired.
It's kind of like positive and negative connotation. There can be
Yes.
underlying meanings to each word you say.
Yes, certainly. I love the fact, for example, if I understand it correctly, and I'm not a Frenchman, but if I understand correctly, if you really, really want to make a Frenchman mad, you call him a vache, which, if I understand, means cow.
Which,
No,
I mean, like,
yeah,
tell someone a cow here, it's kind of weird.
right. But it's not exactly fighting terms.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have all kinds of words that are very special to us, starting out with our own name. One of the things that was part of my own activities when I was very young in the field, was the fact that if we turn up the noise, the louder we turn up the noise, the harder it is for you to understand what I'm saying. Well, this goes without saying. We all know that. But if we turn up the noise to the point where you just can't understand what the heck I'm saying, and then I say your name, you perk up just like that. You've heard it. Now, how is it that you hear something that's in so much noise that you can't understand what I'm saying, and yet you hear your name? There's something special about your name. It's yours, after all, and you're certainly well attuned to it. But you just got done saying you can't understand a darn thing. How is it you understand that?
It's sort of like, sometimes when I'm in like the lunchroom or something, people like, if someone says no, but it's kind of like the southern country no, they say no, and I sort of hear that, like it could be across the lunchroom.
And your ears are right up, right? And nobody, we can talk about it, but why that happens, we don't know. A very, very famous man who's been famous for lots of reasons for most of my life is a guy by the name of Noam Chomsky. He's very much an anti-war leader. He's a pacifist and very, very active anymore, more in that than almost anything else he does. But long ago, when I was just getting excited about this profession, he made the point that language is what makes humans human. And that not any, and again, not what language you have, but the fact that you can process things with language and think about them more concretely. You can pretty much imagine, if you will, because of language. And according to him, even the chimpanzees that maybe might sort of be able to learn some elements of sign language, or even the dolphins, who may be very bright among the animal kingdom, don't have what we have when we talk about language. And it makes, what he said was that human beings have language, that's what we have in common. Despite whatever differences, all the social, political, religious, all the differences, what we have in common is that language key that makes us capable of using our brain to its fullest intent, if you will. Now, some of that gets kind of philosophical, and I'm no philosopher, but I can see where he's coming from, that is something so special to you and me that we take it for granted. And then when we think, oh, look, the dog knows its name, we're saying, oh, yeah, right. Mm-hmm. And when the parrot says, Polly want a cracker, the interesting thing about that, when the parrot says, Polly want a cracker, does Polly really want a cracker, or will he settle for a peanut? Mm-hmm. Or for that matter, if you stroke his feathers, is that enough? You start thinking of Polly. He's not doing the cracker bit. He's just saying something you taught him to say. So who's doing all the work? You. When he gets his sound sufficiently close to Polly want a cracker, that you go and get the cracker box, well, it's you that's doing all the work there, not him, And what it is you're doing, that's what Chomsky means when he talks about language.
Just the simple mimicking of our language is what just fascinates us entirely. Like, watching stuff like parrots and stuff just captivates me just because it's like, wow, something else can do what we do.
Yeah. And obviously, there are relationships between us and the other creatures in skills. And we don't have any idea how those come together, but it seems like the closer you come in the animal kingdom to the mammals that we are, the more like us we see their behavior. Now, especially when it comes to protecting their young and protecting other species' young, things like that. We see animals do that all the time. There's got to be something going on there. And maybe it's not because we share a common ancestry so much as because we share common functions that have to do with being what we are in this world. But people who study these things, that's what fascinates them. Well, what is it? And how far does it go? And what makes us so why is it that you look at the Earth from an orbiter and you see all the lights of all the cities? You don't see the evidence of other living creatures from space. You see us, except for forests, which I'll grant you that may be something to think about. But still, there's this special thing about being human that's taken us so very far.
Well, it looks like that's all the time we have. It was great having you, Dr. Miller. This is Noah Rudolph signing off for Calloway Connections.